what's up guys? Welcome to my complete and updated Ayaka guide. In today's guide, we're going to be covering everything you need to know about Ayaka regarding her best playstyles, covering both freeze and non-freeze teams, and also covering her best builds, teams, constellations, and just everything you need to know to get the most value out of this character and her different builds. Ayaka's always been a character who I really like, although her value and playstyle will vary heavily based on the content you're doing, the enemies you're fighting, and notably if they can be frozen or not, which is why in this video, while it will be primarily focused on freeze Ayaka, which is usually by far the best option, we will be covering different types of Ayaka playstyles so that you really can get the most value out of her regardless of the situation. Before we begin though, I want you guys to know that I do stream most nights on Twitch, link in the description if you're interested, and with that being said, let's get right into it. Alright, now starting things off, let's talk about Ayaka's talents and passives, and really cover how to use her to get the most value. First things first, you need to know that her elemental burst is going to be the main part of her kit. Her elemental burst will unleash this snowstorm that will strike enemies in front of her. This is a really good source of AoE cryo damage that will hit a total of 20 times, or 19 plus a bigger final hit, lasting for 5 seconds with a 20-second cooldown. Now this ability works in a unique way where it kind of like will keep running forward and then stop when it gets in contact with an enemy. If the enemy gets displaced, it can keep moving forward and sort of chase it. But because of how important this ability is, how high the damage is, as you guys can see, it is very essential that you hit every hit of it, which is one of the reasons why I recommend grouping enemies and freezing them for optimal Ayaka teams. While we will cover multiple playstyles in this video, I do believe that Ayaka's best team by far is going to be a freeze one, and the one that we are going to be spending the most time talking about in the greatest detail in today's video, as when you can freeze enemies, it really lets her burst shine and lets you hit every single slice of your burst without having to worry about anything. Now do keep in mind, against boss enemies that can't be frozen, they typically won't get displaced anyways, so your burst can still hit them pretty consistently. You just have to be cautious of when to use it. Now for your elemental skill, it's a very straightforward AoE cryo damage around you that has a 10-second cooldown and okay scaling and will give you some energy. An extra thing to note about this ability, however, is that will also increase your normal and charge attack damage by 30% for 6 seconds after you use it. Now this passive is actually pretty relevant, as Ayaka is a character who can infuse her own attacks with cryo. The way you do this is by using her unique dash, which changes her form similarly to Mona, and then when she pops out of it, it will apply cryo to nearby opponents and infuse her attacks with cryo. This is especially nice as Ayaka's charge attack damage is honestly pretty decent, and while it isn't as good as her burst, it can be a very relevant way to fill in the downtime and use as some bonus damage. Use her as a main DPS alongside your burst and other abilities. An important property to note about your burst though is your other passive talent, which you unlock after ascending her past level 60, which makes it to where not only will you gain 18% cryo damage bonus after you hit an enemy, but you'll also gain 10 stamina. In fact, the way this talent works is you have to hit an enemy with your passive. Like when you pop out, it'll apply cryo to enemies around you, and if you're within that range, even if for some reason you're not applying cryo, because your cryo application does have an internal cooldown, which we'll cover a bit later in the video, as long as you're nearby the enemies and you are hitting them, you will gain 10 stamina, which means that you can dash cancel your charge attacks for free while also gaining 18% cryo damage bonus, meaning that you want to use your dash before pretty much anything else, as getting this cryo damage bonus at the start of your rotation is going to be essential to buffing all of your damage. Other fun things to note about your dash are that it's useful for exploration. Obviously you can like cross rivers and do fun things, and you can also kind of spam it for free against enemies as you're gaining 10 stamina back, and this 10 stamina refund is really nice if you want to like spam dodge to get the free iframes or invulnerability frames if you're afraid that an enemy is going to hit you and you don't want to take damage. Lastly, before moving on, I want to say that your talent priority involves maxing your burst first. This is going to be the most important thing to level, and then your normal attacks, and then lastly your elemental skill. Now regarding Ayaka's playstyles, while I covered it a bit in my last video, if you want more information, Ayaka's best teams and playstyles are going to be primarily in a freeze team. This is because of many reasons, like the Blizzard Sphere set, which we'll talk about shortly, the synergy she has with the characters in the team, and just the overall utility of a freeze team, how nice it is to be able to group up enemies, buff your Ayaka's damage with an Anemo support like Kazuha, and then freeze them all together to where you're not taking any damage. They stay together and can all get hit by your burst, which otherwise can be a bit inconsistent if the enemies are either not frozen or are easily displaced. Because of how important it is to hit the enemies non-stop with your burst, freezing them is going to be a very efficient way of doing so. Because of that and other factors like the Blizzard Sphere set, freeze teams are going to be Ayaka's go-to and what I believe she was designed for. With that said, sometimes freeze doesn't work. Against boss enemies, which are more and more prevalent in the Spiral Abyss, they just can't be frozen, and sometimes using freeze is not going to be ideal, which is when Ayaka can have other playstyles such as a mono cryo team, which is the main go-to option when freeze doesn't work, or others such as reverse melt, hyperbloom / fridge, which is where you use Ayaka as a cryo flex option in a hyperbloom team, and lastly a more burst support build, although this one's less recommended. And in this video, what I'm going to be doing is covering all of her best playstyles, cover the builds for all of these, but primarily focus on her main one, which is going to be freeze or mono cryo, which typically plays the same but without the hydro option as you aren't freezing. And also do keep in mind that while I will be covering, every different playstyle, mono cryo Cryo and Freeze typically follow a similar build path, so when I am talking about Freeze and how to build it, Mono Cryo is typically going to be similar, but just needs a bit more crit rate. The reason for this is because both of these teams revolve around the Cryo Resonance and the Blizzard Strayer set, which give them a ton of crit rate, and while Freeze will gain 60% crit rate total, Mono Cryo will gain 40% because they'll only get half of the Blizzard Strayer's set effect. Alright, now with that said, let's talk about how you actually want to build your Ayaka. First things first, let's talk about the artifact sets that you want, and for an Ayaka who's used in a Cryo-based team, especially a Freeze one, the Blizzard Strayer set is going to be invaluable and the best one by far. In fact, what the Blizzard Strayer set does is give you 15% cryo damage bonus on the 2-piece, which is already quite nice, and then the 4-piece set will give you either 20 or 40% crit rate pretty much for free as long as you're freezing enemies. In fact, if an enemy is cryo affected, so even in a mono cryo team where you're not freezing, you will get 20% crit rate, and then if you are freezing enemies, you'll gain an additional 20% to that for a total of 40% crit rate and 15% cryo damage bonus, making it the best set for freeze Ayaka by far. Because of that, I highly recommend getting this 4-piece set, as if you don't, you do lose out on quite a bit of damage. Now do keep in mind the following things. If you're not freezing on your Ayaka and just running her in a mono cryo team, as long as the enemies are still affected by cryo, this set is still good and will still typically be your best in slot, and if you're freezing, it's even better, giving you that extra 20% crit rate, alleviating your need for crit rate on your artifacts, and making it just the best choice by far. Now with that said, alternatives if you don't have a good 4-piece Blizzard Strayer include mix and matching 2-pieces such as 2-piece Blizzard with any 2-piece attack percent set like Glad, Shimenawa's Echoes of Vermilion, or even 2-piece Noblesse Oblige or 2 Emblem if you need the energy recharge. Lastly, if you plan on playing Ayaka in a non-freeze team like in any of the other playstyles I mentioned, mix and matching 2-pieces will usually be the go-to, and also as a burst support if that's how you choose to play her, 4 Emblem can be good to increase your burst damage, but this is only relevant if you need a lot of energy recharge and not what I recommend as a main DPS Ayaka, as Blizzard Strayer will be your go-to. Oh, and lastly, I wanted to mention that the 4-piece Lava Walker set in a reverse melt team where enemies are going to be affected by Pyro thanks to your other characters can be a viable option, so I did want to include this artifact set, although once again it isn't my most recommended build. Now moving on, for the artifact stats you want, Ayaka is someone who actually really values attack percent, crit damage, and energy recharge. The reason for this is because in a freeze team, you're already starting at so much crit rate. In fact, the Blizzard Strayer will give you 40%, the Cryo Resonance will give you 15%, and then every character starts with 5%, meaning your Ayaka already has 60% crit rate. Now while that isn't the highest amount, like going higher to 70, 80, or even 90 can be optimal, it means you already start with so much crit rate that just getting a bit more in your substats is nice, but you're already starting at a pretty high point to where your crit rate is going to be easy to get to a high amount, meaning you can prioritize crit damage, attack percent, and energy recharge. So because of that, to talk a bit more about these stats, the first thing we have to cover is how much energy recharge does your Ayaka actually need? Well, this does depend on many factors. Typically, a good and optimal Ayaka team, which we'll cover later in the video, will feature another cryo character used alongside your Ayaka to not only get the cryo resonance, but to also generate cryo energy for your Ayaka and allow her to run on much less energy recharge than she otherwise would need. Because of that, you typically don't need that much ER on her, being usually around 140 energy recharge or like 130 to 150 in general, but it can be much lower if you choose to run the Aminoma, her best in slot free-to-play weapon, which we'll talk about in the next section, where you can need a lot less energy recharge, like even 0% if it is fully refined, and if you do have a good team giving you a lot of energy. But again, this does scale on your refinement and the team you're running and a few other factors, so test out what works for you, but do note that Ayaka might not even need that much energy recharge if you're playing her correctly, and especially if you're using Aminoma on her, which will oftentimes be the case if you don't have a good 5-star weapon. Because of that, the stats you're looking for in your artifact are the following. For your substats, crit damage, attack percent, energy recharge, and also crit rate are all going to be good. Crit rate obviously still being relevant even if you have a lot. Just make sure you're not like over capping on it. Always make sure to remember how much bonus crit rate you're gaining other than just your artifacts. Now what this will look like on your main stats is the following. First of all, for your sands, you definitely want attack percent, and for your goblet, you usually want cryo damage bonus, but if you have a ton of external sources of damage percent, like for example a fully refined mist splitter and maybe other sources like Kazuha or Mona on your team, then going for an attack percent goblet can also be viable and can sometimes be better, but generally speaking, cryo damage is going to be the best. And lastly, for your circlets, you can either go for crit damage or attack percent. Both of these are going to be viable, and which one is better for you depends on a few factors, like notably how much crit damage you already have, and also the substats of your circlet. Since attack percent circlets can be common and you can get them passively while just farming artifacts, it is important to note that attack percent can definitely be a viable circlet option, and even a better one potentially if you have better substats and if you already have a lot of crit damage. This is especially true with, for example, a mist splitter and at high investment, but crit damage is still going to typically be the recommended option, although keep in mind crit damage and attack percent are both close, both very viable, and so you can pick based on your substats, weapon, and team. And do note that part of the reason why attack percent is so nice is because you're gaining so much crit rate on the set effect, and it is always important to balance your attack and crit ratio to have good attack as well as good crit, although crit is generally better for most characters. Lastly, before moving on, if you're playing another type of Ayaka build like burst support, then you will need more energy recharge, and if you are playing her in melt, then elemental mastery is viable, but do keep in mind that since she's not melting that many hits of her burst anyways, attack percent is still typically going to be the way to go, and you end up building her pretty much the same. Alright, next up, let's talk about the best weapons for your Ayaka. Now, I want to start by saying that pretty much everyone should be happy in this section, as there is a good weapon option for every player, because while yes, there are really good 5-star options that will increase your DPS, which we'll talk about, Ayaka at least starts by having a good free-to-play option that is genuinely a great option for her with the Aminoma Kageyushi, that is the Inazuma craftable weapon that you can get and refine for free. This weapon is good because not only does it give you attack, which is good for Ayaka, it will also give you a ton of energy on its effect, basically stacking up these succession seeds when you use your skill and then consuming them when you use your burst and regenning energy for you. While this weapon is still good at refinement rank 1, its effect will obviously get better the more you refine it and end up giving you more and more energy. Because of that, this free-to-play option is great because it makes it to where your Ayaka can effectively need like no energy recharge or very little depending on its refinement, typically allowing you to run anywhere from 0 to like 10 or 20% energy recharge in her optimal teams, allowing you to give her more offensive stats, right? The less energy recharge you need, the more attack and crit you can build on your artifacts. Because of that, this is going to be her go-to free-to-play option. However, there are better ones, notably 5-star weapons, which we do also have to cover if you plan on pulling for an upgrade or if you already have them. In fact, her signature weapon, the Mist Splitter, is going to be pretty much by far her best in slot. This is a weapon that is pretty much made for her and will typically be like 20 to 30% more damage than her free-to-play option, as it is, pretty objectively speaking, just really good for Ayaka. It gives you a high base attack, which is great for her, while also giving you a ton of crit damage and an effect that will increase your damage. Do note that while in the last section I mentioned attack percent circlets can be viable, this becomes even more true with the Mist Splitter, as the less attack buffs you have and the more crit damage you're gaining, the more attack percent circlets become viable. But generally speaking, Mist Splitter is her best in slot, a really good option. But do keep in mind that while it is a big increase in damage, I don't want anyone to feel forced to pull for it, as her free-to-play weapons like the Aminoma are definitely good enough and very accessible. And there are also some pretty good other 5-star options that you may already have. In fact, Ayato's signature weapon and the Jade Cutter are two weapons that give you crit rate, but that can still be really good for Ayaka. Now, while yes, I know that Ayaka gains a ton of crit rate, right? She'll gain about 60% total from external sources, to where getting 30 to 40% crit rate on a sword can be excessive. With that said, the amount of stats you gain from both of these weapons is so high that generally speaking, as long as you're not wasting too much crit rate, like even if 5 or 10% of the crit rate you gain is lost, something like the Jade Cutter will still be a good option because you're still gaining so much crit rate, like 44% minus let's say 10 is still going to be 34, which is more than a circlet's worth of crit rate. With that said, crit rate weapons aren't as valuable on a freeze carry as they are on other characters, so I don't recommend it as much, but if you don't have much crit rate on your artifacts and can make use of it, then both the Jade Cutter and the Haran are definitely still good options and not that far behind in DPS, as we'll see in the weapon ranking shortly. Now, similar in strength is going to be the crit damage weapon, the Light of Foliar Incision, which is worse than Mist Splitter but about as good as the other 5 stars, as it gives you 88% crit damage and 4% crit rate. With that said, the rest of the effect of this weapon is not very good on Ayaka, and the base attack is very low, which makes it not her best weapon overall, but still a very good 5-star option if you do have it. Now, similar in strength will also be the Summit Shaper, which gives you a ton of attack percent, especially if you're shielded and are using someone like Diona with this weapon. All those 5 stars that we mentioned are really good, and generally speaking, just better than the other options. Other weapons that are similar in strength to the Aminoma are the following. First of all, 5-star options that I believe are underrated on her are the Skyward Blade if you need energy recharge, and the Aquila Favonia just in general. Now, I know it has physical damage bonus, which is useless on Ayaka, but because at refinement rank 1, this gives you 20% attack on its passive and a very high base attack of 674, this makes it to where the damage you're gaining is generally going to be about as good as the Aminoma. While yes, these 5-star options are about as good as a free-to-play 4-star option, since you may already have them leveled because they're both available on the standard banner, if you already have them, feel free to use them on your Ayaka, but obviously they're not like the most amazing options, as they're about as good as their free-to-play one. Other good free-to-play options also, if you don't need the energy from the Aminoma's effect, include this weapon that I can't pronounce for just some free attack, and also the Blackcliff Longsword if you want that crit damage. Lastly, for another 4-star option, the Black Sword is viable and gets better the more you're charge attacking, but do keep in mind that similarly to other crit rate weapons, this stat may be wasted depending on how much crit rate you have. Alright, with all that out of the way, I'm now going to put a weapon ranking on screen of a freeze Ayaka and how good the weapons are for her. As you can see, she does have a really good free-to-play option that is pretty much better than the other 4 stars or about as good, and then the 5-star options are going to be better, with Mist Splitter being her best in slot by quite a decent margin. Now, do note that while this is mainly for freeze, it will apply basically the same for Mono Cryo, although the crit rate weapons like Jade Cutter and Haran are going to be better, as obviously you can make use of the crit rate more efficiently. Alright, now next up, here are some quick advanced tips and combos you need to know to get the most value out of your Ayaka. First things first, know that you can dash cancel pretty much anything. bursting. Your charge attacks have a long animation, as you can see here, so feel free to dash cancel them. Obviously, you want them to be cryo first, but you can just dash cancel them, and then you'll also get that stamina refund from your passive, which is very important to maximize as long as you're hitting an enemy with it. And so because of that, while you can also like technically jump cancel, it is usually more recommended to dash cancel because of your passive talent. Do keep in mind that you can also dash cancel like your elemental skill, for example, which will otherwise have a long animation. Another thing to note is that your elemental burst does snapshot, which means any buff you give to it will last for its entire duration. This means that you want to give all the buffs that you can to your Ayaka before you use your burst. This can include, for example, Thrilling Tales, or an Nemo support like Kazuha, who can give you elemental damage bonus and decrease the cryo resistance of enemies. You want to make sure you're doing as much damage as possible with your burst, so use everything, set up all your supports before you switch into Ayaka, then also use your dash to gain that 18% cryo damage bonus, and then use your elemental burst. Feel free to also weave in your elemental skill before using your burst, as it will generate some cryo energy that you will gain during the animation of your burst, so then you'll start with just some free energy after you're done bursting. Another thing to note though is that if you do have Shenhe in your Ayaka team, be sure to use her elemental skill pretty early on in your rotation to give the icy quills to all of your characters and increase their damage. The way icy quills work though is that they don't actually snapshot, they just give you more attack for a few hits, which means that what you can do is have those icy quills for your Ayaka, have her buffed when you swap into her, use her burst, and then your first few hits of your burst will be buffed by the icy quills. Then you can swap back into your Shenhe while the burst is still active and use another skill cast, which will buff the next few hits of your already active burst in real time, despite it being an ability that usually snapshots. It's just a weird property of Shenhe's icy quills that you should know if you're playing Ayaka to buff your damage by a little bit. Lastly, regarding your Ayaka's optimal combos, there's honestly quite a few. This is because you want to be charge attacking during the downtime of your rotation. So your burst is the main source of your damage, and then you want to weave in charge attacks whenever you can. Because of that, doing either 1, 2, or 3 normal attacks into a charge attack can all be viable depending on what you're going for. Doing 2 normal attacks into a charge attack is typically the go-to option, but if you have a ton of stamina, you can also just spam charge attacks. And also you should know that these charge attacks from your Ayaka can also hit enemies that are in the air inside of Venti's burst, making Venti a pretty decent support with Ayaka against enemies that can be displaced and lifted up. Alright, now next up for Ayaka's constellations, let's talk about how good they are. First of all, I want to say that her first constellation is mostly useless, but has a chance of reducing the cooldown of your skill every time you do a normal or charge attack, but in an optimal rotation, you're not doing it that often, and this cooldown decrease is typically minimal, so it's not the most valuable constellation. Moving on though, your second constellation is quite nice. It unleashes 2 smaller versions of your burst alongside the main one. Things to note with this ability are that each of the mini ones will do 20% of the original's damage, which is a lot. It's a big increase to your burst damage, which can help you clear content faster. Do note though that these mini ones share the same internal cooldown of cryo application as your main burst, so you can't get like extra procs of melt, for example. But as long as you can hit enemies with all 3 snowstorms from your burst, then this will be a good constellation at increasing your burst damage. Moving on, your C3 and 5 increase your talent levels, with C3 being especially nice as it increases your burst, which is the main part of your kit. And then in between those two, you have your 4th constellation, which will decrease the defense of enemies by 30% when damaged by your burst. Now this is honestly pretty decent, as defense shred is very rare on a constellation and quite valuable. How good this constellation is though depends on the other characters you're using as well, as decreasing the defense of opponents will obviously, yes, increase your Ayaka and her burst damage, but it will additionally buff the other party members you may be using, and you can save some of their burst abilities for after your burst hits enemies and decreases their defense. Lastly, Ayaka's C6 is a very unique one that in my opinion isn't amazing. Like, it has its uses, and what it does is increase your charge attack damage by almost 300% once every 10 seconds, so it'll effectively give you another burst hit of damage. This can be good when paired to Shenhe, or when you just want to speedrun content a bit faster, as you'll get another form of burst damage with 1 charge attack. In practice though, this actually isn't that big of a DPS increase. It's not as big as other limited character C6s that can completely define their playstyle and sort of break the game. This C6 is just a nice little bonus sort of burst damage if you do want it, but it's not the most recommended C6. Overall, Ayaka is a great character at C0, so don't feel forced to pull for constellations, but if you want upgrades, I would either get C2 or C4, which will also come with C3 in the middle, as these are the main ones to go for. Alright, now with all that out of the way, let's finally get into the best teams for your Ayaka. First things first, Ayaka's best team is generally going to be Freeze. She's amazing and one of the best units when enemies can be frozen, and even when they can't, there are variations to this team that you can make, and ways to still make it work quite decently, which we will also cover. But starting things off, a Freeze team is one that follows a very simple formula. Use Ayaka with another Cryo character, and then you pair them with a Hydra support, who will enable the freeze reaction. Lastly, the last slot of your team is typically going to be an Anemo character, who is there to greatly buff your team's damage, thanks to the supportive capabilities that Anemo units bring. In fact, you get access to the Verdescent Venerer artifact set, which will reduce the cryo resistance of enemies by 40%, as well as the fact that Anemo characters can group up enemies, allowing you to freeze them all together and damage all of them at once. If that wasn't enough, a character like Kazuha is exceptionally good in a freeze team, because he will provide your team with this elemental damage bonus on his passive as long as you swirl Cryo. And so with that said, this is generally going to be the best team for Ayaka and your go-to formula for a freeze team. Now, what characters you use here are very variable. While this one here is widely regarded to be Ayaka's best freeze team, obviously it's using all 5-star characters, and this really isn't needed. In fact, every slot here is replaceable, and while each of them can be upgrades, Ayaka can have some very accessible teams even if you don't have 5-star characters. What I mean by this is the following. For your Cryo option, Shenhe is the best, but she isn't that big of an upgrade compared to others like Kazuha or even Mistsplitter, to where if you have her, use her, but if you don't, she is replaceable, don't worry. You can use other Cryo characters like, for example, Rosaria, Kaya, Layla, Diona, or even someone like Ganyu if you want to use her as a burst support. But with that said, even someone like Kaya, who's a just 4-star starter character, is really good and a very underrated option with your Ayaka. Moving on, for your Hydro option, the best two are going to be Kokomi or Mona. Kokomi if you want a 2-in-1 healer and Hydro applier, and Mona for a bit more damage but obviously no healing. While freeze teams can get away with no healing as you're freezing enemies, having a healer is typically nice and convenient, and Kokomi can buff your team as well quite significantly with the Thrilling Tales weapon and the Millilith artifact set. With that said though, if you have Kokomi or Mona, both of them are really the best options for your Ayaka, but if you don't, pretty much any Hydro option can work, like Xingqiu or Yelan, but make sure you're weaving in normal attacks if you use either of them, or even someone like Barbara whose Hydro ring can be enough for Ayaka to freeze, even if it does have more downtime. Barbara is obviously worse than Mona or Kokomi, but she is underrated in this team as she's honestly just enough Hydro to make your burst work, but upgrading your Hydro slot is definitely nice. Lastly, for your Nemo slot, Kazuha is the best for the damage buff that he gives you through his passives, as well as just being a broken character. With that said, other options like Venti can work very well also, and alternatives include Sucrose or Jean, but both of these won't give you as much damage or grouping when compared to Kazuha and Venti. Because of that, I do believe that having someone like Kazuha is definitely a big upgrade for freeze teams, especially when you consider the fact that Sucrose, who gives you elemental mastery buffs on her passives, doesn't actually buff freeze teams all that much, as EM is mostly wasted on a lot of the characters. So someone like Kazuha definitely is a big upgrade, but obviously you can still play freeze variations even without him. Alright, now moving on, the other go-to team when freeze doesn't work, especially against boss enemies, is going to be Mono Cryo. Mono Cryo is just like freeze, but without the Hydro option, replacing it with another crowd character. Now, while I do want to say that if you can freeze most enemies and then there's like one boss in the abyss, using a freeze team still isn't the worst idea, because your Hydro character like Kokomi or Mona can still provide value even if you're not freezing. But in teams like that, Mono Cryo becomes better at single target, and so it can become a viable team and has definitely been getting better the more bosses have been, I guess, sneaking their way into the abyss, but it still typically isn't the go-to recommended team when compared to freeze. With that said, Mono Cryo is good. You just slap 2 random cryo characters next to your Ayaka and an Nemo support like notably Kazuha, and you call it a day. These teams do get a lot better with Shenhe, so if you have her, definitely use her in a Mono Cryo team, although I don't think she's mandatory, but Shenhe definitely does give you a very big increase in damage as her passives and also her burst and skill, just the way they work with the Icy Quills and her passive talents, will just give you a nice amount of cryo damage and attack to your cryo characters. Also, while you can use any Anemo option, I personally recommend either Kazuha or Jean. If you need a healer, what you could do is use someone like Jean or also Sayu as a budget Jean option in this team as your 2-in-1 Anemo user to decrease the resistance of opponents, and healer, allowing you to run a more offensive cryo option. Lastly, for the more weird teams, you can obviously play Ayaka in Reverse Melt Quick Swap, where you're using pretty much all of your characters together, Bennett, Xiangling, Rosaria, or another crowd character, using all their bursts and then going to your Ayaka, using her burst and melting a few hits. As I mentioned earlier, Ayaka's burst will not be melting that often, but Xiangling can also get some melts in, and it's still a pretty decent team. It's just not Ayaka's best, and it's not usually recommended meta-wise, as there are better teams that focus around Xiangling and better teams that focus around Ayaka. Lastly, with the release of Dendro, as I mentioned in my last video, I do believe that crowd characters are very underrated as the last slot in a Hyperbloom team. The way this works is you just use Hyperbloom, so Hydro, Electro, and Dendro, like these 3 characters you're seeing here, and then the last slot is a crowd character, and Ayaka is one that actually works here. While again, this isn't her most recommended playstyle, it actually can work very well. Not only can you passively freeze the enemies because of your crowd character, but you can also get more blooms out of every bit of Hydro you're applying onto the enemies because of how the Cryo and Dendro elements work when used on each other. This is a more advanced elemental theory, so I'll link a few videos that can explain this in more detail in the description down below. But what you need to know is that if you use Cryo on Dendro, it doesn't make a reaction per se, but both of the elements coexist on an enemy at the same time. So then when you use Hydro, it can effectively both freeze and bloom without removing the Dendro element. And then you can Hyperbloom with your Electro character like Kuki or Raiden Shogun and just spam a bunch of reactions and deal really good damage with all of your characters. Lastly, if you just want to use Ayaka as a burst support, feel free to slap her in any crowd team or any team that needs a crowd character to use her for her burst primarily. Alright, now with that said, I'm now going to do an Ayaka showcase of my freeze team in the current floor 12 of the Spiral Abyss. My Ayaka is going to be on an Aminoma R5, so a free to play weapon but fully refined with a really good crit ratio, since my Ayaka is pretty high investment on a 4-piece Blizzard rare, these are the talents, and obviously she is Constellation 0 with a pretty relatable weapon. With that said, I really hope the guide was helpful, and I hope you'll enjoy the showcase. Let's go.
Care for the Cryo incarnate. Dance with me. Do your master's bidding. One with nature. Clouds high. Allow me. Embrace the ice. Unleash. Cryo incarnate. As one with wind and cloud. Allow me. Embrace the ice. Whirling snow. Unleash. Do your master's bidding. Innards manifest. Fallen leaves. Adorn. Hold the line. Surrender. Obey. Take flight. Sakura swirl.
As one with wind and cloud.
Cryo incarnate. Obey. Allow me. Embrace the ice.
Wind strike.
Do your master's bidding. Obey.
Clouds high. Birds call. Wind strike.
Receive it. Sakura swirl. Whirling snow.
And so yeah, that's about it. Overall, I really like Ayaka as a very powerful cryo and freeze carry, especially when freeze works, but also just in general. Overall, I hope I did a good job at giving you guys as much information as possible in this video. Do let me know if it's getting too long though. Obviously there's timestamps and stuff, but I know this video is a longer one as there were a lot of details to go over. Maybe in the future I should focus more on 1 or 2 playstyles, but I really do like including as much information as possible to help out the most people. But as always, I really hope this guide was helpful, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.